Joining us now, Peter Nowak. He is the author of Sex, Bombs, and Burgers: How War, Porn, and Fast Food Created Technology as We Know It. That's a great title. Did you come up with that title?
Some of it, yes. Some of it, no. It's actually kind of funny. The publisher, my publisher in Australia, they didn't like the original title, which was actually Bombs, Boobs, and Burgers. They thought it sounded a little too Benny Hill.
But great alliteration there.
Yeah. Well, that was the original. I guess what they meant by Benny Hill was that it was too lowbrow. I guess right. Benny Hill is considered lowbrow comedy. That was news to me.
Well, this is very highbrow, all this stuff. And as I say, it's a highbrow book. I am now going to ask you a question about Paris Hilton, because apparently her sex videotape was the inspiration for this book. Now you've got to explain that.
Yeah, indeed it was. I came up with the idea sort of germinated, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago when this sex video of hers was making it, the rounds on the internet. And I remember watching the video, and I don't know if whoever's seen it, it's probably noted that it was filmed in night vision, so it was kind of, there was a green tinge to it. I remember seeing that, thinking I'd seen that before, and I kind of thought about where it was, and it took me back to the first Iraq War back in 1991, the liberation of Kuwait. All the images of that war that we saw, the images on CNN were all green tinged, obviously in night vision. So that got me thinking about, hey, how do these military technologies eventually evolve into consumer technologies? The more I looked into it, the more I found that just about everything does. The military comes up with so much stuff, and it eventually evolves into consumer uses. Paris Hilton was a great example too, because not only was this a military technology that had evolved to the consumer world, but it was also being used for kind of a sexual purpose, essentially pornography. From there, I got into how the pornography industry really jumps on early technologies too, and how they really provide some of those early development dollars to really bring things to the mainstream.
Okay, here's the follow-up though. You're watching a Paris Hilton sex video, and the first thing that comes to mind is, wow, isn't that interesting how that Defense Department night vision is making this video possible? Is there something wrong with you?
I think there is. I'm an extraordinary nerd, I think is what it says.
I can tell. Well, all right, let's go into this then. Why do you think, I mean, you've got the list here, sex, food, and war are such important technological drivers?
Well, I think we can start with food, because food is really the basic on which, when you're talking about the developed world, it's the basis from which all of our other luxuries stem. Any developed nation really has stabilized its food supply to start with. And there's a whole lot of technology that goes into that, whether it's, processing the food, transporting the food, keeping it cold, all that stuff. There's an astounding amount of technology that goes into that. And once you've got your food supply secure, then you can start thinking about exporting things and creating some sort of trade. And that's where prosperity comes from. So, we can't really worry about whether we're going to get the newest iPhone or whether we're going to get a flat screen TV if we're really worrying about where our next meal is coming from. So that's essentially where the technology comes from. Okay. It's really the basics.
Those are all the sort of more recent innovations, the list you just gave, but I want to take you back in time. Let's go back to the World War II years and the technological innovation that emerged from all of the military activity of that time, for example.
Well, to go back to food, a lot of the food technology that we have today really stems back to the Second World War, because there's a real strong link between food and war. Militaries are often the biggest consumers of food technology, because they're taking their soldiers and they're sending them across the ocean. They need to somehow feed them. That was the case during World War II. So we had all of these new technologies come out, like dehydration and flash freezing of food and powderizing and all this stuff. So all this stuff came out. Now, to go beyond food, though, the military is also responsible for just tons and tons of stuff. Whether it's the microwave oven. Microwave is kind of an offshoot of radar, which was invented during the Second World War. A lot of the plastics that were invented for things like sealing the pipes used in the Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb. Some of that stuff spun off into things like Teflon and Saran wrap, the list of examples, and there's probably hundreds or thousands of them in the book. There's just tons of them.
And military technology affecting civilians today, what's on that list?
Well, robots is the big thing. I think the average person, when they think about robots, they think of the Japanese robots, the ones that play violins or that can play soccer. But those robots are fantastically advanced, but they're really expensive. They're millions of dollars each, so they're not actually practical. Where practical robots are happening is with the military. So there's companies that are making robots to defuse bombs or explore caves, or even to shoot missiles at terrorists from up in the sky. They're learning by working for the military how to create useful robots and how to create them cheaply. So one company, for example, is a company based out of Boston called iRobot. They make these bomb disposal robots for the military, but they're also making the Roomba vacuum cleaner, which many people have in their homes. So it's a dual market. They're learning how to basically make things cheaply and useful for the home market, for the much bigger home market.
And I guess something we all take for granted now, and most of us use every single day of our lives, the internet. That came out of the military as well.
Yeah, exactly. That was originally, the original idea behind the internet was it's going to be this communications network that can withstand nuclear attacks. So, if the eastern seaboard in the United States was taken out by a missile, phone communications could continue on the West Coast and that sort of thing. And that eventually evolved into, this military, it was called the ARPANET. And once consumer phone companies were allowed to connect to it, that's when the internet was born.
Now, we talked about the connection between the food industry and the military. How about the connection between the food industry and the space race? What's the story there?
Yeah, NASA, I remember it was kind of funny a few months ago when NASA launched the rocket into the moon just to see what would happen. A lot of commentators came out and said initially nothing happened. So a lot of people came out and said, oh, NASA's this big waste of money, which in researching this book, I couldn't disagree more. NASA has provided so many spin-offs, more than military almost. So many things, from things like UV coating for sunglasses to super soaker squirt guns, just tons of stuff. But one of the most important things they did is some of the food technology that they've developed. One of the most important is something called Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. I think that's what it is, HACCP. I can't remember exactly what it stands for. But it was developed during the moon mission, the first program to send people up to the moon.
Apollo.
Yeah, so they enlisted Pillsbury, the doughboy people, to design their space food because they had to feed the astronauts up there, right? And Pillsbury, when they got to work on it, found that their entire food production system was so inadequate and so behind the times of what NASA had these incredibly high standards that they revamped everything. So Pillsbury eventually started testing every process of the food system, whether it was getting the ingredients to processing it, to transporting it, to packaging, etc. And so they came up with this HACCP system. This system is now used by every developed nation, by every food processor in every developed nation, and it's what keeps you and me from getting sick every single day when we eat food.
And it's because of the space race.
Absolutely.
They need to get into space. Artificial flavoring. Does that come out of this as well?
Yeah, that's another side effect of the military research into food. It's sort of a twofold process there. One of the tools that was developed in the 20th century, one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, which nobody really knows about, is something called the mass spectrometer. It's this scientific instrument that allows scientists to measure the atomic weights of elements. And so it really came on during the Second World War. It was actually used in the Manhattan Project to create the bomb. And after the war, food scientists really took to using this thing to deconstruct food down to its molecular level. So really the secrets of food were laid bare. So there was always a mystery of how is Coca-Cola made? Well, with the mass spectrometer, you could figure out exactly what was in it, right? So that was kind of the birth of the chemical industry and the food flavor industry. And also the perfume industry really took off thanks to these things, which is kind of scary because a lot of the perfume makers are also the flavor makers for food. I always kind of found that kind of disturbing.
Let's return to porn if we can for a second here. People of a certain generation, when they think World War II, and I don't know if porn is the right word, but let's call it erotica, we'll think of Betty Grable. But we're a little beyond that today. How did porn grow out of World War II? Again,
that war, I guess, without that war, it was just such a horrible and devastating war, but so much has come out of it. I mean, we're still seeing the effects of it. We're still, I guess you could say, enjoying the byproducts of it. And not that porn is an enjoyable byproduct, but what happened was, during the war, the military had a huge need for footage for films, whether it was for training purposes or whether it was for newsreels back home or whether it was for propaganda purposes. So the U.S. military in particular enlisted a huge number of soldiers and trained them basically as semi-professional filmmakers. And they couldn't train them on, you know, the cameras that Hollywood was using at the time, which were these big 35 millimeter film cameras. They were so huge they had to have wheels to move them around. So what they did was they gave them these smaller, more portable cameras, 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter film cameras. And these cameras, because the soldiers had to use them, they had to use them in wartime conditions, they had to basically be made interchangeable, the parts in them, so that if they broke down, they could quickly swap in a lens or whatever. So they made them interchangeable, they made them easy to use, and in doing that, the cost of these cameras came down. The end of the war came around, and you had thousands of these soldiers go off back into civilian life. And they were all basically amateur, not even amateur filmmakers, they were semi-pro. And they had nothing to do. So some of them decided, hey, well, let's film our kids' birthday parties or our barbecues. Others decided to go, well, let's go professional. Yeah. So these were the first real indie filmmakers in the United States. Some of them went on to make, you know, award-nominated films like Stanley Kramer. He did Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, or I can't remember his film titles, Ship of Fools, I think. But others, notably a guy named Russ Meyer, he went on and basically invented the pornography genre. Back then it was called sexploitation, but it was what we would consider by today's standards to be sort of softcore pornography, just basically nudity. But in the 50s and 60s, that was pretty much unheard of. And there was a huge market for it. People lined up to go see these movies.
All because of the technological innovation that happened during World War II.
Yeah, exactly.
That is a line from A to B that I had not seen drawn before reading your book. Okay. Let's come forward again now. Some of the biggest technological advances to come out of the wars that have taken place over the last decade in Iraq and Afghanistan. Help us with that.
Well, the first Iraq War, obviously other than Paris Hilton sex videos, well, night vision is, of course, one of the major technologies that was developed then too. GPS is a major one. That was sort of in the process of being developed by the military right around late 80s, early 90s. But when the Iraq War started, they really pressed it into service. And as the mid 90s came along, I think it was President Clinton decided that, hey, this would be a great civilian application. There was a airplane crash in Korea, which happened because two planes came too close to each other. That was sort of the what started off the whole move to make GPS available to civilians. So that was one too. Personal computers, although they really first came out in the late 70s, early 80s, they really only started to take off in the early to mid 90s when Microsoft started standardizing Windows. And I don't think it can be understated how much of a customer the military was for Microsoft. Norman Schwarzkopf, the general who led Operation Desert Storm, he called it the technology war, and he basically thanked the computer for allowing his troops to have, you know, basically more intelligence than they've ever had before. And what was powering those computers was Windows.
Do you have every expectation that sex, bombs, and burgers are going to continue to shape technology going forward?
Yeah. Over the past century, I guess it's pretty much a no-brainer to say the United States has really been the hub and the core of technological research and development. It's just where the dollars have been. I think the U.S. is responsible for nearly 50% of the R&D dollars spent in the world today. But it's changing. Obviously, China is on the rise, and some of the other Asian countries around it too. And China has no desire to continue being the just, you know, sort of the dumb manufacturing center of the world. There's a major push in China to become an intellectual center, an intellectual property center as well. So they're really pushing forward in technological innovation too. And the three needs, the three sort of base instincts that my book is about, they're international, they're universal. China is actually, strangely, even though there's a widespread ban on pornography in China, China is still actually the world's biggest consumer of porn, strangely. And they're modernizing their food system as well as we speak. They're one of the fastest growing markets for companies like McDonald's and KFC. and China is the world's second biggest spender in military. So yeah, it's universal. I think these three things are going to continue, as sad as it may seem to some of us who wish we could be better as people.
I still think you should have gone with bombs, boobs, and burgers, but that's another story. Sex, Bombs, and Burgers is what the book is really called. And Peter, we're grateful you came in at TVO tonight to talk about it. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much.